I'm Lori Boyer, City Council member for District 5, and had the opportunity to chair the Task Force on Consolidated Government that Councilman Gulliford created about 5 years ago now, I think.
And it took a look at consolidation to see what might need to be improved, etc. What, in your mind, were the highlights?
So when I was speaking after we had finished, I think I came down to about 4 key points that were takeaways. Generally, I would say the first thing was that we felt there was a lack of a consolidated vision or mission statement for the city as a whole. Our independent authorities each had their own, and our sheriff's was somewhat different than the consolidated city government. And so what we thought, one of the things that appeared to us is that we could be more competitive in a national market. We could accomplish more as a city if we had that more cohesive vision of who we were and what we were trying to achieve and where we were going. So that was one.
In that sense, we're not quite as consolidated as we could be.
That's exactly one of the things that we discovered. So going back, the part of the history of the consolidation was that there were multiple layers of government, and there were people running the city parks department and the county parks department, and all these various levels of duplication. I think at the time of consolidation, everything was pretty much reined in under one umbrella, and maybe lasted for about, I think, 10 to 15 years from what we discovered. And then we started to see this gradual creeping deconsolidation. And part of it is the independent authorities that have grown in their importance and their independence. So for example, JEA provided electric originally, and then now JEA provides water and sewer, which has a lot more interface with our infrastructure system. So there are those kinds of things. JTA became very involved, not just in Expressway Authority, but running the transit service, and then later building the better Jacksonville roads. So what you've seen is things that would have been handled in the consolidated government kind of being shipped out to various entities, and that has increased over time, one after another. So the first thing was this kind of lack of cohesion. Second thing was that as a very large, somewhat bureaucratic government, but the fact that we were big, we have a problem that we have a very big, diverse county, and one size doesn't fit all. And what might be appropriate in the far west side is not the same thing that might be appropriate in downtown or might be appropriate in, so you have this variety of neighborhoods, and yet we try to use the same solutions everywhere. And that's a bit of a challenge for us. And people don't feel as connected or feel like they're receiving personalized service. Like when we went to the beaches and held town meetings and stakeholder meetings at the beaches, the residents there were very happy with their local government. We didn't get the same sense in Mandarin or in Avondale or on the north side in Jacksonville. And so I think that was partly because people don't feel as close to their government and have as many opportunities. So that was the second thing. A third thing was kind of going back to the deconsolidation, but one of the ideas initially is we were going to be very efficient and effective, and we were going to have centralized services for things like copying and printing and PR, and there was a whole laundry list in the original consolidation vision, that we would not have separate functions in the sheriff's office and in the general city government and at the port and at JEA, but now we do. Or the supervisor of elections office or the clerk of the court's office. So all of those have their own and differing. Some have their own IT departments for one reason or another. Some have their own public relations and media but each one has kind of stepped away from those central services that were originally envisioned. So some of those cost savings and some of that effectiveness we've lost. And let me see if I can recall the fourth one. I might have to look. I presume you're editing this.
Sure.
Easy. The loss of continuity and momentum. So when we consolidated, we didn't have term limits. And what we have found comparing Jacksonville to many other cities that we were looking at, the newer forms of government have county managers or city managers, and we did not. And what we experienced was not only the term limit changeover of city council and the mayor, but perhaps more impactful was then the changeover of department heads and the changeover of the CAO. And so what Jacksonville had experienced was some move forward, step back a little bit, regroup, get your feet under you, move forward again, then step back a little bit, rather than the continuous path forward you see in some of the cities that we were looking at and comparing ourselves to. So Charleston, Indianapolis, Nashville, others come to mind where they seem to have a longer track record and ability to stay on a course. And that doesn't necessarily mean term limits. Could be term limits would impact that. In the Charleston case, I believe the mayor was the mayor for a very long time, 20 years plus. But it also happens just in the case of if you have a consistent manager. So back in the early days of consolidated government, Lex Hester was that for Jacksonville and stayed regardless of who was mayor.
Without the title of city manager, in
Right.
effect, he was.
Correct. So some of those things we tried to address legislatively or in charter amendments. And so we created some criteria now for the CAO position to assure that they have some history of running a city government, whoever takes over that position. But it's still a challenge for our structure as we have it. So those were the things that we discovered that maybe we could do better. There were a lot of positives also.
Now, some of those things are easier to fix than others.
Mm-hmm.
And I assume we don't want this report from a few years back to just sit on a shelf and gather dust.
Absolutely not. And we've been continuously working on implementing one piece after another. And I'm glad you're doing this because there are many people who served on that task force who may not even be fully aware of all of the things that have been implemented. So we started out at the very beginning with a couple charter amendments, maybe 9 months after the final report came out. And that dealt with the CAO, dealt with the Office of General Counsel, dealt with a few things like that. So we got those adopted right away. Then we went through and we've made any number of ordinance code changes based on recommendations in the report. And in fact, Councilman Gulliford is still holding meetings maybe once a month that I attend, and Sam Musa, who is now our CAO, but who also served on the task force, attends. And we've been working through how we address the neighborhood recommendations about what neighborhood associations participate in a CPAC and what the structure of CPAC meetings, citizen planning advisory committees. And that is in part the way we were trying to connect the big government to the neighborhoods and to the people. So we've been working on that. That's something this year we've done. We've addressed some of the central service recommendations this year. Now, there are some things where we are doing cooperative joint agreements with the independent authorities to share resources, for example, someone has a better deal on a computer program, software program, and we'll piggyback on that and use the same one. So we're working together better. I don't think it's realistic that we will ever completely bring everything back in the fold and have one centralized central services department as we started out with.
So this is the kind of thing that the initial view of consolidation, something happened along the way and now it needs to be fixed
Right.
for the most part. What do you think Jacksonville would be like if the voters had said no in 1967?
Well, we looked a little bit. That's a hard one to try to,
Speculation.
right, to try to guess what might have happened or might look like. We had the University of North Florida faculty member who did some demographic research for us on looking at the core city, what was the city of Jacksonville, and then looking at the consolidated city and comparing population demographics, comparing income levels, comparing where businesses were located, because we were trying to, when we first started out, kind of take a snapshot of that as best we could. And mind you, when we did this, when the task force met, we were just coming out of the recession, and Jacksonville was really lagging behind Tampa, Orlando, Miami in recovery. Other Florida cities had done better. And so part of it was, well, is there something about our consolidated form that is holding us back? Did we not? What's different, and why is that the case? So I think that what we accomplished, part of what was accomplished with consolidation, was we were seeing this flight of the tax base to the suburbs from the core city. And yet the residents in that suburban area were coming in and working in the core city. It's not unlike what consolidated Jacksonville experiences now, with residents who live in St. Johns County and Clay County and Nassau County and come work somewhere, whether it's at South Point or downtown or on the north side, but they're working within the consolidated city, but they're not living here. And because we are so dependent on residential tax revenue from where people live, it presents a challenge. It presents an operational challenge for the budget. There's no question about that. I think that as you're seeing now, both a desire among millennials and baby boomers to live in more dense areas, that helps Jacksonville, because it gives us an ability to redevelop and create more density within the city boundaries. But while we were seeing that push to the suburbs, every time that happened outside the county boundaries, we lost. We were still having to provide the services, but we were losing the revenue source. So I think that was a little bit of a detriment for us, because we'd been able to rely, unlike those other cities who had long ago figured out how to make their systems work, we kept relying on the next residential development that was suburban, and then there were no more. There was no more room.
Now, I guess we would hope that the work that your task force did would continue after you leave office, for example. Do you think that is likely?
I would think so. I know Councilman Gulliford, who started it, is really, he's desirous of seeing other pieces implemented and continuing to work on it. I mean, we've made it through 80% of the things that were recommendations that came out. But some of it is just an awareness and being continuously mindful.
Some of it is public awareness.
Absolutely.
PR, whatever you want to call it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Every time we create a new tax increment district or a new tax increment there was a push to do that for UF Health a number of years ago. You're familiar, there was a push to do it for the libraries. About the same time, the task force was considering consolidation. And that was one of the things that we said, well, every time we do that, that's a little bit deconsolidating.
That's exactly right, yeah.
So.
No matter how good the cause.
Exactly, it didn't.
It's not in keeping with the spirit of consolidation.
And so so you're right, trying to keep that in perspective and make sure that the next city council and the next mayor understand, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, that they're still mindful of why we did this and what are the positives and how you make it work. and what you need to be kind of on the watch for and not let happen.
Because consolidation has been here so long that almost everyone in Jacksonville just takes it for granted, may not even be aware of it.
I think that's absolutely true. We found that among many of the people who came before us, they really weren't completely sure what it meant or why it had happened, and what the benefits were. We did find in the business community there was a real sense that it was a positive, in that it was you might have to go to multiple departments to get a permit for something or to do business in a particular field, but at least it was all one city government. You weren't trying to deal with multiple layers of government.
Well, are there other things that you would like to note about consolidation or the task force efforts?
Well, I would say one of the most interesting things was that we interviewed all of the former mayors, and who were still living, and it was clearly one of those perspectives that there was this very rosy, enthusiastic excitement about consolidation for probably at least 15 years. And it really carried us very well during that time period. And perhaps it wasn't until Mayor Delaney took office, about that time period, that the honeymoon had started to dissipate, and you were seeing us start to have challenges where we started to lose the vision. And I think that if we are going to continue in the form and use this structure, then it's important that we retain the vision, because that's how you make it work. If you lose sight of what the goal was and what you were trying to achieve, you just become a big bureaucratic city. And that's not very positive or effective for anyone.
And I guess the challenge is to ignite the enthusiasm of a new generation, because the founding fathers, so to speak, of consolidation are no longer with us. And so there's a natural, as you say, dissipation of enthusiasm and so forth. And so that's a mission.
Well, one of the things that we talked about, and I don't know that I really mentioned it, it's part of this cohesive vision, is that Jacksonville doesn't have an identifiable brand as a city compared to Nashville, the music city, or, I mean, you can name them across the country. Many places do. You identify something very clearly with the city. And again, perhaps in part because of our size and diversity, it wasn't easy to land on what that was, because we have a lot of different things. I think that that's probably important to us. When you talk about having the next generation or people in the future have that enthusiasm for the consolidated form of government, part of it depends on us all feeling like we belong to the same city. And then having that kind of branded vision of who we are, what do we stand for as a city, I think is important to us. We sometimes lack pride in our city. And I mean, certainly I'm not saying everyone does, and we don't all the time, but there are often times where we're critical of Jacksonville, and Jacksonville really is an amazing place and has a lot of positives associated with it. So we need to capture those in a way that everyone can relate to, and I think that's going to be the trick to making people appreciate the value of consolidation 10 and 20 years from now.